A cop testifies under oath, painting a quiet woman as violent, unhinged, and dangerous. The courtroom nods in agreement, until the woman calmly reaches into her blazer and flashes something no one expected. The air turns ice cold. Who is she really? And why does the judge suddenly look pale? What if the entire trial was part of something much, much bigger? The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that didn't feel like peace, it felt like fear. Elena Ross sat with her hands folded neatly in front of her, expression unreadable, her dark eyes fixed on the man taking the stand. Officer David Braddock stood tall in his uniform, his voice calm, confident, and rehearsed. "She resisted arrest violently," he declared, gesturing toward Elena with a subtle sneer. "She kicked me in the chest, tried to reach for my weapon, and screamed obscenities the entire time." Murmurs echoed from the gallery. The prosecution nodded with smug approval. But something in the judge's expression betrayed discomfort. It wasn't just the severity of the charges, it was the woman herself. She hadn't said a single word since the hearing started. She hadn't flinched. Her face was a mask of stillness, but it wasn't the blank stare of someone defeated. It was something else. Something watchful. Every time Braddock embellished the story, claiming she lunged, cursed, threatened, Elena didn't so much as blink. It was unnerving. A defense attorney sat beside her, visibly nervous, whispering occasionally, but Elena never responded. It was as if she didn't hear, or simply didn't care. The judge leaned forward slightly, studying her. Her record was bizarrely clean. No prior arrests. No employment listed. No online footprint. No family who'd come to the trial. Her case had raised eyebrows from the start, but the paperwork had all the right signatures. A local arrest. A formal charge. A pending conviction. All routine, except for Elena. Braddock continued, now performing for the room. "I feared for my life. She was aggressive, unpredictable, dangerous." He wiped imaginary sweat from his brow and gave a slight shake of the head. "I don't know what she was on, but I've never seen someone so detached from reality." The prosecutor smiled. The gallery nodded. But then, Elena slowly turned her head and looked directly at Braddock. For the first time in hours. The room shifted. His words stalled. Her gaze was steady, clinical. The kind of look that didn't scream anger or fear. It was the look of someone who knew far more than anyone else in the room. A young man in the back of the courtroom squinted at her, as if recognizing something he couldn't quite place. A journalist. A federal clerk. Someone not meant to be there. No one noticed him scribble a note and tuck it into his coat. The judge finally spoke. "Ms. Ross, is there anything you wish to say in response to these allegations?" Silence. Elena didn't move. Her defense attorney cleared his throat and stood. "Your Honor, the defense rests." A rustle of confusion passed through the audience. No cross-examination. No challenge. No testimony. Braddock smirked. "Guess she knows what she did." But the bailiff, standing by the door, kept his eyes on Elena. He'd seen thousands of defendants, he knew fear, anger, remorse. This woman had none of it. What she had was control. She was calm like a coiled spring. Like someone waiting for a trigger. Outside, the sky grew darker. Thunder echoed in the distance. Rain began to streak down the courthouse windows. The judge checked the time, then turned toward Elena once more. "We'll reconvene after a short recess. Be ready to close arguments." As the room emptied, Braddock walked past her with an arrogant grin, muttering under his breath, "Say goodbye to freedom." But when Elena stood, she leaned in slightly, not enough for anyone to hear except him, and whispered something that made him freeze mid-stride. His face drained of color. For the first time all morning, Braddock looked scared. The bailiff caught the shift. So did the young man in the back. Elena sat back down, serene as ever. The courtroom may have believed Braddock's story, but she knew something they didn't. And soon, so would everyone else. 2 years before Elena Ross sat silently in that courtroom, she didn't exist, not in any way a civilian could trace. No driver's license under that name. No tax records. No school diploma or social security number that matched the woman they thought they were prosecuting. Elena Ross was a fabrication, a shadow carefully crafted by a clandestine arm of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, an identity manufactured for a long-term infiltration assignment so sensitive that not even the regional field office had full details. Her real name was classified, redacted from every open system and buried behind need-to-know levels of clearance. But the woman behind the alias had been born in Quantico, so to speak, trained in psychological warfare, embedded surveillance, and behavioral extraction. She was one of the Bureau's most versatile ghost agents, deployed for high-risk undercover assignments where moral ambiguity was not only accepted but required. The file that Officer Braddock never saw, because it didn't technically exist, was locked in a burn room beneath Washington, D.C. The few who knew of her assignment called her the ghost in the badge. And this ghost had been living in a place no Fed wanted to be, a small southern town rotting from the inside out, where corruption ran so deep it drowned those who tried to swim against it. Her target wasn't just a dirty cop. It was a syndicate, a web of judges, district attorneys, sheriffs, and high-ranking officers that had turned the entire county into a quiet empire of extortion, intimidation, and judicial manipulation. Elena's assignment had begun with a name: Sheriff Callum Dyer. He ran the department like a business, an empire propped up by falsified evidence, illegal seizures, and a dark network of accidents that happened to anyone who asked too many questions. But taking him down wouldn't be as simple as gathering dirt. They'd tried that before. Whistleblowers vanished. Witnesses recanted. Internal affairs was either paid off or too scared to touch the case. What the Bureau needed was someone invisible. Someone who could get close, let the network believe she was just another powerless outsider. So they built Elena. Gave her a backstory, a low-income apartment, a job at a local antique bookstore. Every detail was curated. And she played the part so convincingly that no one suspected the quiet woman with the neutral accent and thrift store clothes had federal-grade spyware stitched into the lining of her purse. Over time, Elena began to map the terrain. She observed which patrol units conveniently ignored certain neighborhoods while others were repeatedly targeted. She learned which local businesses paid safety fees in unmarked envelopes. She followed the money trail from the court's asset forfeiture department to a private account registered under a shell company in Delaware. She documented how repeat offenders were assigned the same lenient judge, who dismissed key evidence without batting an eye. But what made the operation fragile wasn't the system's complexity. It was that Elena had to appear helpless while standing in the center of it. She could never intervene. Never warn a victim. Never blow her cover, even when she watched innocent people get torn apart by the machine she was sent to dismantle. Braddock entered the picture 6 months before the courtroom trial. He wasn't just a cog in the machine, he was the one who greased it. His arrest record was inflated with trumped-up charges, mostly against minorities or low-income residents with no legal defense. But his real talent wasn't paperwork, it was intimidation. Elena first crossed paths with him outside a late-night diner, where he was roughing up a teenager for allegedly loitering. She said nothing. She didn't even look twice. But she recorded every second from the lipstick-sized lens hidden in her necklace. Over the following weeks, she watched him escalate. Unlawful searches, planted evidence, and one incident that nearly turned fatal when a local mechanic was mistakenly identified as a fugitive and nearly beaten unconscious. And yet, Braddock always walked free, with glowing commendations from the sheriff. That's when Elena began laying the trap. She left breadcrumbs, small, intentional anomalies in her routine that would draw Braddock's attention. Late-night drives. Loitering near areas he patrolled. Always just enough to raise suspicion. She knew the type. Braddock liked soft targets. The quiet ones who wouldn't fight back. Who wouldn't have family to call. Who wouldn't be believed. So she made herself the perfect victim. What she didn't expect was how fast he'd take the bait. One stormy night, it happened. Braddock pulled her over under the pretense of a broken taillight. The rest unfolded predictably. He demanded she step out. She complied. He began probing her vehicle without cause, ordering her to sit on the curb while he rifled through her glove box, never realizing the tiny black dot in the corner was a transmitter. She watched him pull her wallet, examine her fake ID, mutter something derogatory, then flash a twisted grin as he slapped on the cuffs. But what made the moment burn into her memory wasn't the injustice, it was the way he enjoyed it. The smirk. The power rush. The cold confidence that nothing would touch him. He drove her to the station, fabricated the report, bruised her wrist with zip ties too tight, then tossed her into holding without booking her. She sat there for hours. Never cried. Never screamed. She knew the bureau would be watching. She knew her arrest would trigger the first red flag in a cascade of contingency protocols. But what she didn't know was that Braddock, overconfident and stupid, would push for a public trial. It wasn't just arrogance. He wanted a record. A victory. Proof that he was above the law. And Elena gave it to him, stone-faced, unreadable, and waiting. Because that trial wasn't her undoing, it was the final piece. The moment the court would hear his lies on record. The moment the hidden footage would make its way up the chain. The moment the ghost would uncloak, and judgment would fall not just on him, but on the empire he served. The rain that night came down in sheets, hammering the windshield like a warning. Elena drove slowly, wipers barely keeping up as streetlights flickered and reflected in puddles that turned the backroads of Ashford County into winding rivers of glass. She wasn't scheduled to make contact that evening. Her handler had told her to lie low, let the storm pass, avoid patrol routes. But Elena had a plan, and that plan required baiting the hook. She'd been driving the same loop 3 nights in a row, slow, irregular turns, making herself visible but not overtly suspicious. The Bureau's internal timer had already started ticking, and she needed the arrest on record. She needed to see how far Braddock would go without provocation. It would be the final test before triggering Phase 2 of her operation. The trap wasn't ready until the monster revealed itself. At 10:42 p.m., headlights flared behind her. A white cruiser. No sirens. Just a shadow trailing her like a predator waiting for weakness. She turned onto Crestview Road, a mostly deserted stretch lined with pine trees and aging street lamps. The cruiser followed. She switched lanes without signaling. That was the cue. The red and blue flashed behind her. She pulled over slowly, the car perfectly aligned with the curb. Her fingers moved calmly to the glove box, touching a near-invisible switch that activated the encrypted recorder buried behind the vent. Her face, always unreadable, stayed locked in neutral. Outside, Braddock approached her window like he owned the night. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked, voice already laced with smug superiority. She didn't answer, just offered her license and registration. He looked at the ID, federal issue fake, expertly crafted, and held it just a second too long. "Step out of the car." She blinked. "Is there a reason, officer?" He narrowed his eyes. "You asking me questions now?" The game had begun. She stepped out. Hands visible. Posture relaxed. She was the picture of submissive compliance, and he hated it. Because Braddock didn't want obedience. He wanted fear. He ordered her to sit on the curb in the pouring rain. Her clothes soaked through in seconds, but she never flinched. He popped the trunk without asking, then rifled through her backseat, muttering things to himself loud enough for the bodycam, which he didn't know was malfunctioning, to catch vague soundbites. Probably on something, got that dead-eyed look. He returned to her, bent down, face inches from hers. "You been drinking tonight?" She said nothing. He slapped her ID back into her lap. "Stand up." She obeyed. His hand gripped her arm, tighter than necessary, fingers digging into skin. "Turn around." She did. "Hands behind your back." She hesitated, half a second. Enough to give him an excuse. "You resisting?" he barked. Before she could move, he twisted her arms behind her, zip-tying her wrists so tight she felt the skin split. She didn't cry out. The pain was expected. Necessary. He shoved her against the hood of her car, her face pressed against the cold metal. Her breathing remained slow, measured. The internal microphone recorded every insult he muttered, every curse, every accusation that would later contradict his courtroom performance. He radioed dispatch, but coded her as non-compliant female, possible substance influence. No backup requested. He didn't want witnesses. The ride to the station was silent. She sat in the back of the cruiser, her head tilted slightly, memorizing every movement, every detour. He didn't take the usual route. Instead, he turned down a side road, then another, finally stopping behind an old auto shop whose security camera hadn't worked in years. He parked, got out, lit a cigarette, opened her door and stared at her. "You like messing with cops, don't you?" She looked him dead in the eyes, calm, patient. He stared back, waiting for fear, for an apology, for submission. He got nothing. Something shifted in his expression. For the first time, he looked unsettled. He slammed the door shut without another word, drove back onto the main road, and finally reached the station 20 minutes later. At booking, he logged the arrest under vague pretenses: disturbance, non-compliance, verbal aggression. No drugs found. No weapons. But the report told a different story. Suspect resisted. Tried to flee. Made threatening statements. He knew how to game the system. He'd done it for years. She was fingerprinted, photographed, then left in holding with no call, no formal charges, no citation. Just darkness, flickering fluorescent lights, and the distant sound of a leaky pipe. She sat on the bench, soaked, wrists bruised, and whispered 4 words into the pinhole MIC embedded in her collar. Contact initiated. Braddock confirmed. 6 hours passed before a tired desk sergeant released her with no explanation. "Charges dropped," he grumbled, never making eye contact. "Just don't cause any more trouble." She didn't argue. Didn't smile. Just walked out, shoes squelching against the tile, into the dawn. The storm had passed, but the streets were littered with broken branches and debris. She got into a ride-share, leaving her car behind. It had done its job. By noon, the footage had already been backed up through a secure relay to a satellite server. The Bureau's internal alert system flagged the incident as actionable. A case number was opened. The DOJ quietly requested a copy of the dashcam footage from Braddock's cruiser, which conveniently malfunctioned during the traffic stop. The police report was pulled. Cross-referenced. The inconsistencies piled up. And yet, Elena didn't return to her handler. She didn't request extraction. She went back to her apartment, made tea, and waited. Because Braddock had made his fatal mistake. He assumed he was the predator. He never realized she was the one writing the rules. When the court summoned her for the hearing, she didn't flinch. She asked for a public trial. She wanted it all on the record. Every word. Every lie. Every twitch of Braddock's ego as he dug his own grave. She didn't need to fight him physically. She was going to destroy him with silence, truth, and timing. The trial wasn't her judgment day. It was his. The courtroom lights felt warmer after the recess, but the mood had cooled. Something invisible had shifted in the air, like the entire room had exhaled uncertainty. Officer Braddock, now seated with his legal team, sipped from a bottle of water with an exaggerated calmness. But beneath the table, his leg bounced uncontrollably. Elena hadn't moved. Her expression, still unreadable, hadn't cracked since she first sat down. Her attorney glanced at her every few minutes, hoping for some signal, some cue, some reaction he could use to shape a defense. He got none. To the untrained eye, she looked lost. But Elena's silence was not surrender, it was surveillance. Every minute in that courtroom was part of the operation, and every face in the room was a variable she'd been trained to study. What she didn't expect was to find her own agency's timeline unraveling faster than planned. And what she feared most wasn't Braddock, it was what would happen if she was forced to act before the Bureau gave her the green light. Seated 3 rows behind the prosecution's table was a man with close-cropped hair, a grey blazer, and a face that screamed federal oversight. Elena recognized him instantly. Special Counsel Dorian Hayes, Department of Justice liaison, usually brought in when cases were too politically explosive for the local system to handle cleanly. He wasn't supposed to be there. His presence wasn't authorized in the shared case briefings. Yet he was watching her, intently, as if he knew exactly who she was. His arrival meant one of 2 things: either her cover was compromised, or HQ had escalated the operation and failed to inform her. Either way, the decision tree had just splintered in ways she didn't have time to analyze. The prosecution called its next witness, Sergeant Fallon, Braddock's longtime patrol partner. He took the stand and nodded in Braddock's direction, a silent signal of loyalty. Officer Braddock and I responded to the call. I arrived shortly after backup was requested, he said. Elena's brow twitched, a millimeter of movement most wouldn't notice. No call had been made. Braddock never touched his radio that night until after she was cuffed. This was a coordinated perjury. The system was closing ranks. Fallon continued. Ms. Ross was hostile. She refused commands. I witnessed her kicking the patrol car window and yelling profanities. Another lie. Elena had stayed perfectly still, eyes forward, lips sealed the entire time. Yet the courtroom was lapping it up. The prosecutor nodded. The judge made notes. And Elena could feel the sand slipping through the hourglass. Her handler hadn't responded to the last 2 secure pings. If the DOJ had intervened, they may have sealed the communication channel. She was operating blind, and worse, the evidence she'd gathered, the real footage, hadn't been officially submitted yet. The Bureau's sting was supposed to culminate with a simultaneous reveal of documentation, surveillance files, and legal injunctions. It was a domino effect designed for precision. But if Hayes was here, then the dominoes had already begun to fall, and she was no longer controlling the board. She weighed the options. Stay silent and risk being sentenced for crimes she didn't commit, effectively removing herself from the operation but protecting its long-term success. Or reveal herself now, possibly compromising the larger investigation but saving herself from an unjust conviction. There was a third option: wait. See if Hayes would make the first move. But waiting came with consequences. The judge was inching closer to final statements. Her own lawyer looked like he was preparing a closing argument with nothing in it but hope. Then something strange happened. A woman in a blue dress entered the gallery and sat beside Hayes. She carried no notebook, no badge, no press credentials. But Elena recognized her, too, Marla Vexley, Internal Affairs at the Bureau's Eastern Division. Not a field agent. Not a handler. A cleaner. The kind of operative you sent in when a mission was either about to be shut down or go public. And that's when Elena knew the Bureau had decided to end this on their terms, not hers. Her instinct screamed to act, but she froze. This wasn't just about Braddock anymore. This was about control. If the Bureau pulled the plug without giving her a direct order, it meant they were protecting something bigger. Possibly someone in the syndicate higher than Dyer. Possibly a judge. Maybe even a politician. Suddenly, Elena wasn't just an agent caught in a trap. She was bait dangling in front of a beast that hadn't yet shown its face. She glanced at Braddock. His confidence was starting to fracture. Sweat lined his brow. He'd seen Hayes, too. Maybe he didn't know who Elena was, but he definitely knew something was off. He leaned into Fallon and whispered something. Fallon nodded, stone-faced, then shifted in his chair as if preparing for a confrontation. Elena read it like a playbill. They were getting ready to spin something. Possibly say she threatened them after the arrest. Maybe introduce a false audio clip. It wouldn't be the first time corrupt officers manufactured evidence. The judge returned to the bench, shuffled some papers, and asked both sides to prepare closing statements. Her attorney stood, trembling. He leaned in and whispered, "Unless you give me something, I have nothing. We lose this." She met his gaze, finally, and said just 5 words. "Do exactly what I tell you." Then she stood, breaking protocol, disrupting the courtroom, drawing gasps. The bailiff moved toward her. The judge barked, "Ms. Ross, sit down." But she didn't. She reached into her jacket. And paused. For just one breath, she waited. If Hayes wanted to stop her, he would move now. If Vexley had other orders, she would speak. But neither did. Their silence was permission. Elena's fingers brushed the cold metal of her badge. Her other hand slipped toward the edge of a document tucked in the inner pocket. Time stretched. 1 second. 2. 3. Then she sat back down. Not yet. One more piece was missing. And she needed Braddock to say one more lie, on the record. One that would trigger the collapse. The courtroom calmed. Her attorney gave the judge a weak nod. "Defense will rest." Braddock smiled again, shaky but still smug. Fallon smirked. But Hayes and Vexley didn't move. They just waited. And so did Elena. Because the game wasn't over. It was about to begin. The air inside the courtroom became impossibly still as the judge prepared to deliver his final remarks. Sunlight filtered in through the high windows now, casting long shadows across the bench and soaking the room in a deceivingly peaceful glow. Officer Braddock sat upright, hands clasped, his eyes scanning the floor in front of him like a man waiting for a storm he couldn't quite see but could definitely feel. Sergeant Fallon leaned back in his chair, arms folded, the smugness from earlier now tempered by something more cautious. The prosecution straightened their papers. Elena Ross didn't move. But her pulse had changed. She could feel the electric charge in her fingertips, the subconscious tension building in her spine. It was time. The judge, a man known for his pro-police leanings, cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom. Given the testimonies presented and the evidence, or, frankly, the lack thereof from the defense, I see no reason to delay this verdict. Ms. Ross, based on what I have heard, you have shown nothing but contempt for the authority of law enforcement, and your silence has spoken volumes. He adjusted his glasses. Therefore, Elena Ross is not who you think she is. The voice cut cleanly through the room, not Elena's, but her defense attorney's. The judge snapped his head up, startled, as the gallery erupted in murmurs. Elena turned to her counsel, but he didn't look at her. He was reading something she had slipped him only seconds earlier. A folded, worn document with a watermark that shimmered under the courtroom lights. Hayes shifted in his seat. Vexley's face remained cold, unreadable. The judge banged the gavel. Approach the bench. Now. The attorney complied, handing over the paper without a word. The judge unfolded it, eyes scanning faster than his lips could move. Then he froze. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed. The color drained from his face, his jaw clenching tightly before he leaned back in his chair. This is highly irregular, he muttered. But admissible. Elena stood. Slowly, calmly, deliberately. She reached into the inner lining of her coat and drew out a small leather folder. The courtroom gasped. She held it up, arm extended just enough for the light to catch the silver and blue seal inside, a federal badge. FBI. Her voice was quiet, steady, and final. Special Agent Elena Ross. Serial number 4T99-27A1. Authorization memo embedded in the document just handed to Your Honor. My arrest, my silence, and this trial are all part of a long-standing bureau operation currently overseen by the Department of Justice's Office of Internal Oversight. Braddock's mouth fell open. He didn't blink. Fallon looked as if someone had punched the air from his lungs. The gallery descended into chaos. The judge banged the gavel again, but the sound barely registered over the swell of voices rising from the back. Reporters whispered into their phones. Court officers instinctively reached for weapons but paused when Hayes finally stood. Special Counsel Hayes stepped forward, lifting his own badge. Judge Mallory, for the record, everything Agent Ross has just said is true. This court was chosen specifically because of its pattern of misconduct and questionable trial outcomes, of which today's proceedings were the final confirmation needed to trigger a DOJ internal investigation. Agent Ross has gathered hundreds of hours of surveillance, including video and audio from the night of her staged arrest. That evidence is already being processed by federal teams as we speak. The judge looked like he might faint. You used this courtroom as a test. Hayes didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Elena. You're clear. She nodded once, then walked directly to Braddock's table. His breathing was shallow, eyes darting wildly between her face and the badge. You set me up, he whispered, barely audible. No, she said calmly. You set yourself up. I just made sure someone was watching. At that moment, 2 U.S. Marshals entered the room through the rear door, flanking Fallon and Braddock. The officers stood frozen as warrants were read out loud. Fallon tried to protest, but his voice cracked. Braddock didn't say a word. He just stared at Elena, as if trying to process how he'd gone from confident accuser to federal detainee in under 60 seconds. But the twist wasn't over. Elena turned back to the gallery and made eye contact with Vexley. The woman gave the slightest nod, then opened a briefcase and pulled out a laptop. A projection screen was unrolled at the front of the courtroom. What followed was a highlight reel of corruption. Dozens of videos taken from inside precinct hallways, cruiser dashcams, interrogation rooms, and backroom meetings. One showed Braddock laughing about falsifying a report. Another caught Fallon delivering cash to someone off-screen. Another showed the judge, red-faced and shouting at a young defense attorney, demanding a guilty plea for a case with no physical evidence. The courtroom watched in horror. Several jurors stood up. A reporter cried. And through it all, Elena stood still, watching the empire collapse. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't angry. She was simply finishing what she started. The judge stood, his face ashen. This court is adjourned indefinitely. All verdicts issued by this bench over the past 6 years are now under federal review. He turned to Elena. And you? I don't know if I should thank you or be afraid of you. She responded without blinking. Both would be appropriate. Outside, the news vans had already gathered. Someone had tipped them off. Braddock was led away in cuffs, the same model he'd used to injure countless people who couldn't fight back. Fallon screamed as he was dragged out. The courtroom emptied. But Elena remained seated, staring forward, her badge resting on the table beside her. Hayes approached her. That was clean. Risky, but clean. You just broke the spine of a 5-year cover-up. I didn't break it, she replied. I let it snap itself in two. And then, as if nothing had happened, she rose and walked out. Not through the back, not through the basement. Right through the front doors, into the cameras, into the questions, into the sunlight. Because the real trial was only just beginning. 3 days after the courtroom imploded under the weight of its own lies, Ashford County's courthouse doors were locked. Not temporarily, indefinitely. A federal notice, laminated and bolted to the front gate, declared it a sealed site under active investigation. Local reporters camped on the sidewalks, whispering into cameras with wide eyes and trembling voices, trying to piece together the storm that had struck their sleepy town. Arrest warrants were served to 9 officers, 3 clerks, 1 bailiff, and a local judge. Subpoenas were drafted for 2 sitting state representatives and a county sheriff who hadn't been seen since the afternoon of Elena's revelation. In less than 72 hours, the tight-lipped corruption network that had ruled the area like a shadow government had dissolved into fear, confusion, and federal manhunts. And yet, amid the chaos, the name Elena Ross vanished. Not in scandal, not in glory, just silence. The records from the trial were sealed. The footage displayed in court was labeled classified, filed under a restricted intelligence operation, and removed from public viewing. The reporters who tried to probe further were stonewalled with federal injunctions. A few articles surfaced online, titled with vague phrases like "Mysterious Courtroom Disruption Leads to Statewide Inquiry" or "Federal Sting Uncovers Deep-Rooted Corruption in Ashford County." But none mentioned her. The woman at the center of it all had disappeared once again, slipping back into the anonymity that had always been her greatest weapon. Braddock, now in federal custody, sat in solitary confinement, awaiting pre-trial motions for conspiracy, obstruction, and perjury, charges that would almost certainly keep him behind bars for decades. Fallon flipped within hours of his arrest, offering volumes of information in exchange for a lighter sentence, confirming a web of misconduct that reached further than anyone had suspected. Sheriff Dyer was caught crossing the state line 2 nights later, disguised, driving a stolen vehicle, with $2 million in cash in the trunk. When he was arrested, he reportedly muttered, "It was the quiet ones. It's always the quiet ones." But Elena didn't care about the headlines. She was already gone. The Bureau had relocated her within 24 hours. A new identity, a new assignment, and new marching orders had been delivered in an unmarked envelope with no return address. She now lived in a townhouse 2 states away, under the name Claire Whitmore. She worked at a municipal archive building, cataloging old documents and digitizing records. A perfect cover. Nobody questioned the quiet woman who spent her days scanning history and her nights drinking tea on the balcony, watching the neighborhood lights flicker to life one by one. Still, the sting had left a scar. Elena didn't miss the violence, the deception, or the weight of pretending to be powerless. But she did feel something close to sorrow, not for herself, but for the people she couldn't save before the net closed. The ones who'd been trampled by the system she'd dismantled too late. Their names haunted her like ghosts without graves. She had watched too many suffer in silence, too many records erased, too many families destroyed because the world believed uniforms meant truth. Now she knew better. She'd seen what happened when power met impunity. And she had learned, painfully, that justice wasn't something given, it was something carved out, piece by painful piece, by those willing to risk everything in the shadows. From time to time, she received envelopes with no sender. One contained a still frame from the courtroom projector, showing Braddock's face mid-reaction to her badge reveal. Another included a list of pending cases linked to former Ashford officers, all being reopened. But one stood out, a child's drawing. A crude sketch of a woman holding a badge, with the words "You're my hero" written in shaky crayon handwriting. No note. No name. Just that. She kept it in a drawer beside her bed. 3 months later, in a courtroom 200 miles away, another case began. A familiar pattern. A young black man charged with assaulting an officer, no bodycam footage, no witnesses, and a record that didn't quite make sense. The public defender looked tired. The arresting officer looked smug. The judge had the same hollow tone Elena had heard too many times. But in the back row of the courtroom, just barely visible between two reporters, sat a woman in a grey sweater with dark eyes and an unreadable expression. She said nothing. Took no notes. Just watched. The trial began. The officer took the stand. His story began to unravel. He fumbled a line. Then another. Then he paused. Something about the gallery had made him hesitate. He looked into the crowd and locked eyes with her. His breath caught. His skin paled. He didn't know her name. But he knew that stare. And suddenly, everything he'd planned to say died in his throat. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, he'd heard rumors. Whispers about a woman, an agent, a ghost who surfaced only when the system got too comfortable with its lies. They said she didn't yell, didn't fight, didn't threaten. She just showed up. And when she did, things came apart. And now she was watching him.